For this problem here, again, we're going to look at finding these different pieces of information. For stretching factor is going to be the absolute value of my multiplier in front of the secant. So I take the absolute value of -3, gives me +3. Again, it corresponds to the amplitude of the corresponding cosine function. And the period, because it's based on a cosine function, can be found by taking 2 pi divided by whatever the multiplier is in front of the x. So 4, the 2 and the 4 cancel, leaving us our reduced period, which is pi over 2. The phase shift can be found by taking this whole expression that's inside the function, setting it equal to 0. So what value of x gives you a 0 there? And here, if we solve for this, we get x is 0. So that means there is no phase shift, okay, or it's 0 units. Okay, these next set of information, the relative mins and maxes and then the asymptotes, are found by sketching the graph of this. So the way I'm going to sketch the graph is I'm going to find the corresponding cosine function. So if I take -3 times the reciprocal cosine of 4x plus 2, so this is going to give me the reference graph that I'll use. So if I set this up, I see that my graph here gets shifted up 2. So here's where my midline's going to be located. And then my amplitude of this cosine function is a -3. That means that I move up 3, so that gets me to 5. And I move down 3, 1, 2, 3, gets me to a -1. So those would be my min and max of my cosine function. Okay, now, my cosine function, again, a cosine graph in general starts at the maximum, and its 5 critical points are maximum, midline, minimum, midline, maximum. But when this one has a negative in front, so when you take and put a negative in front, it gets flipped, giving us a critical points at a minimum, the midline, the maximum, the midline, and the minimum. So this is where I'm going to find my critical points for cosine. So what I want to do on this is I want to plot those points. So when I plot the points for this reference graph here, what I can do is start at my minimum. So I know I'm going to have a minimum. There is no horizontal shift, so I'm going to start at the 0 is my minimum. And I know that my period is 2 pi, so this is going to go minimum, midline, maximum, midline, minimum. And this whole sequence is going to take this period of pi over 2. So this is 0, and this is pi over 2. So what I can do is I can find where these other points are by cutting pi over 2 in half, find the halfway distance between 0 and pi over 2, which is pi over 4. And I'm going to cut that in half again. So half of pi over 4 is pi over 8. So really what I'm looking at is each of these critical points is a distance of pi over 8 apart. So pi over 8, 2 pi over 8, this would be 3 pi over 8, 4 pi over 8, and that gives me my 5 critical points. So what I can see here is that my cosine function is going to be something like that. And so everywhere that there's the cosine passes through this midline, I'm going to have a vertical asymptote. So if I sketch in the vertical asymptotes for this secant function, so here's all my vertical asymptotes for the secant, and what that does is I can fill in the secant everywhere there's a maximum on my cosine, there's going to be a minimum on my secant. So here's my secant graph, create U-shaped graphs in between those asymptotes up on top, and then everywhere there's a minimum on my cosine function, I'm going to put an upside down U shape, and that's going to be my secant function. So my graph of the secant, the graph of this secant function right here is this graph in green. Okay, but what this tells me here is that each of these points along the secant, these are all relative minimums. They're the lowest points in these U shapes. So the relative minimum is going to fall at 5. And then each of these points along here are my relative maxes for my secant function. They're going to all at the top of these upside down U's. So my relative maximum for the secant is going to be at -1. And now again, this is counterintuitive, mentioned in some of the other videos that's counterintuitive because 5 is greater than -1, but 5 is the minimum, -1 is the maximum. If they were asking for this cosine function, it would be the other way around, right? This would be a maximum and this would be a minimum, but because we're dealing with the reciprocal function, this is a minimum here, and this one is a maximum. So finally, the last piece is these vertical asymptotes. So I see the vertical asymptote to the right of my origin is this graph right here, or this vertical asymptote right here at pi/8. So x equals pi/8 is the vertical asymptote to the right of the origin, and the one to the left of the origin I can see is right here, and that one is the same distance from 0 but toward the left, so that one is -pi/8. And so those would be the answers I'm looking for in this problem.